Эдика съели?
Легкие попробовал.
Легкие?
Легкие, да.
It was August 1995 in Saint Petersburg, and officers had just entered a one-room flat belonging to a quiet local man named Ilshat Kuzikov. For weeks, human remains had been appearing near the rubbish bins around his building, and investigators already feared the person responsible was living somewhere close. Then they opened his door. Inside the flat, they found bottles filled with blood, jars with preserved human remains, dried skin, severed ears, and a pot of prepared flesh sitting in the kitchen like an ordinary meal. Parts of the latest victim had not even been taken out yet. They were still inside the apartment, waiting for Ilshat to finish what he had started. But Ilshat did not panic. He stayed calm, as if police had only interrupted him during a normal day at home. But his concern was not the arrest, nor the evidence or the victim. It was whether the preserved remains would spoil if they were not kept cool. That was when investigators understood the kind of place they had entered. To them, it was a crime scene. To Ilshat Kuzikov, it was his kitchen. But what made the case even harder to accept was this: the warning signs had been there for years. And when the case finally cracked open, it would become one of the most disturbing cases in Russian history. But before we begin, if you find this video interesting, please give it a like at the end and tell me what you think about the case. It really helps the channel. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from. And don't forget to subscribe for more. Thank you. By the time police reached the rubbish bins near house number 22 on Orjonikidze Street, the woman who made the call already knew she had not found ordinary waste. It was August 1995 in the Moskovsky district of Saint Petersburg, and she had only been walking her dog when the animal began pulling toward one of the bins. At first, there was nothing strange about that, because bins in warm weather often carried a bad smell, and dogs often followed anything that caught their attention. But then she moved closer. Near the rubbish were glass jars filled with cloudy liquid, and inside those jars were human organs. Then, in the bin itself, she saw the head of a man. It had been left there with the rest of the discarded material, close enough to a residential building that anyone taking out rubbish could have seen it. When police arrived, they secured the area and began identifying what had been found. The man was later confirmed to be 43-year-old Edik Vassilevski, known as Edik. The condition of Edik's remains told investigators that whoever did this had taken time with him after death. His body had not simply been left in one place. Parts of him had been separated. Some had been placed in jars, and other parts had been dumped near the same building where residents had already been complaining about strange smells and disturbing signs. So this was not only a murder scene, it was a message investigators had been too late to read. And as police began checking the area, one fact made the case even more alarming. Edik was not the first man to be found near those buildings. He was just the one who finally forced everyone to look closer. In November 1992, residents of house number 22 had noticed a strong smell coming from the basement. It was not the kind of smell anyone could easily ignore, so people went down to check. And what they found brought police back to that building years before Edik's name ever entered the case. Inside the basement were human remains that had been separated into parts, including a male torso with the internal organs missing. It was clear that the person had not died there by accident, and it was also clear that whoever left him there had used the basement because it was easy to reach. However, the basement doors were not properly secured, and almost anyone could walk in from the street or from the building. So even though the remains were found under the same building where Ilshat Kuzikov lived, police could not prove that the person responsible was one of the residents. The trail became weak, the victim stayed unidentified, and the case did not lead to an arrest. Then, almost 3 years later, in July 1995, the pattern returned. Residents again found human remains near the same group of buildings. This time, a man's head was found in a rubbish bin, and not long after that, hands and arms were found near a neighboring apartment block. The victim was identified as 37-year-old Mikhail Bochkov, known as Misha. So by August 1995, police were no longer looking at one terrible discovery near one rubbish bin. They were looking at 3 men connected to the same small area, the same kind of disposal, and the same disturbing pattern. The killer was not moving bodies across St. Petersburg, he was leaving them close to home. So investigators began looking beyond the rubbish bins and basement doors because the location alone was not enough. They needed a connection between the men, and when they started tracing where the victims had been, who they knew, and which institutions they had passed through, the same kind of link began to appear. Edik Vassilevski had a psychiatric history. Mikhail Bochkov had also spent time in psychiatric treatment. And the earlier victim, Alexander Pichonkin, known as Sasha, had moved through that same world too. These men were not only being found near the same buildings, they had also crossed paths with the same vulnerable circles, the same clinics, the same drinking groups, and the same kind of people who could disappear without anyone pushing too hard for answers. Then one name started coming up: Ilshat Kuzikov. To some people around the building, he introduced himself as Igor, and that was the name many neighbors and drinking companions knew. He lived close to where the remains had been found in house number 22 on Ordzhonikidze Street, and he was already known to psychiatric services. He had spent time in treatment, and he had kept friendly contact with men he met there. So when investigators learned that victims had links to psychiatric clinics, Ilshat was no longer just another strange man in the area. He became someone who stood in the middle of several lines at once. He lived near the disposal sites, he knew men from the same treatment circles, and people were known to come and go from his flat. But even then, he did not look like the kind of person neighbors immediately feared. Some described him as quiet and polite. Others said he was helpful, calm, and almost harmless in the way he carried himself. He was the kind of man people could see every day without thinking he was capable of anything serious. However, another version of Ilshat existed behind that same door. Other neighbors had seen blood in the stairwell. They had smelled something terrible coming from his flat. They had noticed scratches on doors and missing peepholes. And one elderly neighbor later said they had complained more than once, only to be told it was minor hooliganism. So by then, police had two pictures of the same man. One was Igor, the quiet neighbor who drank, helped people, and seemed harmless. The other was Ilshat Kuzikov, the psychiatric patient whose flat sat near the center of every discovery. And once investigators placed those two pictures side by side, they knew they could not keep watching from outside. They had to get into his apartment. Police could not walk into Ilshat's flat on suspicion alone, so they used a simple cover story, the kind that would not sound strange in an old apartment block. A maintenance problem. An officer came to the door, pretending to be a plumber, and the water was cut first, so the visit would feel routine. They needed to get inside before Ilshat had time to clean, hide, or move anything. So the officer approached the flat as if he was there to check the plumbing. At first, the visit had to look ordinary. It was just another repair call, just another inconvenience in a building where residents were used to broken systems and shared complaints. But once the door opened and the officer stepped inside, the story changed immediately. The smell came first. It was heavy enough to tell him that something was wrong before he even understood what he was looking at. Then, in one part of the flat, wrapped inside a jacket, were human legs that had been separated from the body. That discovery ended the disguise. Within minutes, Ilshat Kuzikov was arrested on suspicion of killing Edik Vassilevski, but the officers had only seen the first piece of what was inside that apartment. The full search turned the flat from a suspect's home into the center of the entire case. They found bottles filled with blood, jars with preserved human remains, dried skin, ears, pots, marinated flesh, and human colodettes prepared like food meant to be kept and eaten over time. The kitchen was strangely clean compared with the rest of the flat. The knives were kept in good condition. A book called Man in the Kitchen lay there like something from a normal home. There was also a white cook's coat, which matched the nickname that later followed him, the Cook. But nothing about that kitchen was normal. Ilshat later explained that he had no working refrigerator, so he prepared food in ways that could last for several days. He made colodettes because it could sit longer. He preserved, dried, and marinated because he said he needed the meat to keep. And by the time police finished looking around, they were no longer asking only whether Ilshat had killed Edik. They were asking how many times he had done this before they finally knocked on his door. Edik Vassilevski was 43 years old, and to most of Saint Petersburg, he was the kind of man who could pass through life without being noticed. He lived on the margins, he had psychiatric problems, and he moved through the same unstable circles where alcohol, poverty, and hospital treatment often overlapped. But to Ilshat Kuzikov, Edik was not a stranger from the street. They knew each other through treatment circles, and some accounts said their relationship may have gone further than friendship. In fact, Edik had painted Ilshat a picture. So when Edik went to Ilshat's flat, he was not walking into the home of a stranger. But at some point during that visit, Edik went into the bathroom. Then Ilshat followed him. Then there was a confrontation inside the flat, and Edik tried to resist, but he could not get away. Ilshat overpowered him, and after Edik was dead, the bathroom became the place where Ilshat continued what police would later describe as his routine. He kept the parts he wanted. Then he began moving the rest out of the apartment piece by piece. But this time, he did not finish quickly enough. Some of Edik's parts were left near the rubbish bins, and other parts were still inside the flat when police finally entered. That was what connected the apartment, the jars, the smell, and the body parts outside into one clear chain. Edik's death exposed Ilshat, but it also revealed something more frightening. Edik was the last proven victim. But he was not the first man who had trusted Ilshat enough to walk through that door. There was another victim whose disappearance had already left clues behind. His name was Mikhail Bochkov, known as Misha. Misha was 37 years old, and like Edik, he lived a difficult life on the edge of society. He was homeless, he had a history of psychiatric treatment, and he moved through the same groups of people that Ilshat often spent time with. These were people who drank together, shared temporary places to stay, and often went unnoticed when something happened to them. That was what made them vulnerable. People knew them, but fewer people were paying close attention to where they went or who they spent time with. Misha had known Ilshat for some time, and the two men had spent time together drinking. On one of those occasions, they were inside Ilshat's flat when an argument began. What started as a disagreement later became the second confirmed killing connected to Kuzikov. According to Ilshat's later statements, the situation escalated inside the apartment, and he attacked Misha before continuing to deal with his body inside the flat. He later admitted that after killing Misha, he had cut his throat, and that was the first time he tasted human blood while it was still warm. Afterward, he moved the body to the bathroom, where he separated the parts he wanted to keep and removed the rest from the apartment. Were not taken far. Just like the later discovery involving Edik, parts of Misha were left close to the same buildings where Ilshat lived. In July 1995, residents found Misha's head in a rubbish bin near the apartment blocks. Later, additional, including parts of his arms, were discovered nearby. The findings shocked the neighborhood, but investigators still did not have enough information to connect the crime directly to Ilshat. Then, just weeks later, another discovery would force investigators to look at the case differently. Alexander Pichonkin, known as Sasha, had known Ilshat through psychiatric treatment. Like the other victims, he was familiar with him long before the police ever learned his name. There was no reason for Sasha to be suspicious when Ilshat invited him over for drinks. It looked like another ordinary evening between two men who already knew each other. They drank together, they talked, and as the evening went on, Ilshat suggested they become intimate. Sasha refused. Ilshat even told him he could leave, but Sasha had been drinking heavily, remained in the flat, and was reportedly becoming sleepy. Then everything changed. Ilshat had Sasha inside the apartment, using both force and a knife during the encounter. Sasha died there, inside the flat of someone he had trusted enough to visit alone. What happened afterward established a pattern that investigators would later recognize in the other cases. Ilshat removed Sasha's clothing, then removed his own, and took Sasha into the bathroom. There, he separated the body into sections, kept certain soft tissues and internal organs for himself, and prepared to dispose of everything else over time. Some of Sasha's remains were taken to the basement beneath the building, while others were discarded in nearby rubbish bins. Weeks later, residents noticed an unbearable smell coming from the basement. When police searched the area, they found human remains in a condition that made it clear someone had deliberately tried to separate and conceal the body rather than leave it intact. The discovery immediately became a homicide investigation, but the location created a serious problem. The basement was not locked. Residents came and went. Strangers could enter without attracting attention. Anyone could have carried something inside, and anyone could have walked back out again. So investigators had no direct path to one particular apartment or one particular resident. They searched, they questioned people, and they examined what evidence they had, but the investigation stalled before it ever reached Ilshat's door. Looking back, that moment became one of the most significant missed opportunities in the entire case. But the story of Ilshat Kuzikov did not begin in that flat on Ordzhonikidze Street. It began decades earlier, on February 27, 1960, in Leninabad, in the Tajik Soviet Socialist Republic. Ilshat was born into a home where violence was already part of daily life. His father, Ilshat Kuzikov, drank heavily, and when he drank, he turned on his wife and children. By the early 1970s, when Ilshat was around 11 years old, that violence reached the point that shaped the rest of his life. Ilshat killed Ilshat's mother, or beat her so badly that she died, and Ilshat and his brother witnessed it. After that, Ilshat was imprisoned, and the two boys were sent to Leningrad, where their aunt took them in and became their guardian. But by then, something had already changed in Ilshat. He was still a child, but people around him began noticing signs of serious mental illness, so he was placed on psychiatric registration. But that's not all. He said the sight of blood and surgical procedures began to affect him in a sexual way, and instead of being horrified by the human body being opened in medical programs on television, he became fixated on it. So he wanted to become a surgeon, and his interest in bodies, anatomy, control, and death stayed with him for years. But he couldn't pursue that dream because he struggled academically. Ilshat also made claims about his teenage years that were deeply disturbing. He said he had an incestuous relationship with his brother. He also told investigators about a large turtle he had kept as a child. When asked what happened to it, he said he had smashed it with a hammer. And when they asked him why he did it, he gave one answer: "I don't know." That answer revealed something important, because long before the rubbish bins in Saint Petersburg, there had already been signs that Ilshat's relationship with violence, bodies, and suffering was not normal. And the warning signs had been building for more than 20 years. Ilshat's interest in medicine never became a career, so after school he moved into a very different trade. He trained as a reinforcement worker and electric welder, and for a while, that seemed to be the path his life would follow. It was ordinary work, practical work, and it gave him a place in society, even if his mental health was already unstable. Then, in 1980, he was drafted into the Soviet Army. That was where his violence moved from private warning signs into an official record. In 1982, Ilshat attacked a fellow soldier with a wrench and hit him on the head. The incident was serious enough to bring him before psychiatric examiners, but instead of going to prison, he was diagnosed with schizophrenia and sent for treatment. After that, he was discharged from military service and returned to Leningrad. Because of his psychiatric disability, Ilshat received a social pension and a separate apartment with a telephone at house number 22 on Ordzhonikidze Street. At the time, that was not a small thing. Many families in Leningrad were still living in communal flats, and many people waited years for a private phone, but Ilshat had both. For a short time, it looked like the system had given him a chance to live quietly. He had a place to stay, he had a pension, and he later married a woman he met during psychiatric treatment. She understood hospital life because she had also been connected to that same world, and for a brief period, Ilshat seemed to be building something close to normal. But that stability did not last. His drinking became worse, his behavior became harder to live with, and during one conflict, he attacked his wife. She left him and filed for divorce, ending the one relationship that might have kept him connected to ordinary life. Later, when investigators asked why all of his proven victims were men, Ilshat tried to present himself as someone who cared deeply for women. He said he loved women and could not raise his hand against them, even when homeless women stayed in his flat and, in his words, sometimes did things that upset him. But that claim did not fit the record. His wife had already left because he had attacked her. But after the Soviet Union collapsed, Ilshat's life became even more unstable, and the small structure he still had began to fall apart. His disability pension lost its value, his savings disappeared, and the money that once helped him survive could no longer cover the basics. For a while, humanitarian aid kept him going. Food was distributed to people who had little, and Ilshat depended on it because he had almost nothing else. But when that aid stopped, the hunger returned. He tried to earn small amounts wherever he could. He worked as a cleaner at a local market, and he collected empty bottles to sell for money. After Ilshat was arrested, investigators already had enough evidence to connect him to Edik Vassilevski, but they still needed to understand the full scale of what had happened inside that apartment. So they questioned him for 2 days, but he won't say anything. So the investigator realized that Ilshat would not speak openly to people who looked at him with disgust. So the approach changed. The investigator made Ilshat believe he understood him, even presenting himself as someone who shared his interest in Cannibal. And that was when Ilshat began to talk. At first, he gave the explanation he wanted everyone to hear. He said he had been hungry and that his pension was too small. He said he could not afford enough food, and he tried to make the killing sound like something poverty had pushed him into. He also tried to make himself appear merciful. He claimed he gave his visitors a chance to leave before anything happened. If they walked out, he said, he let them go. But if they stayed, then they became victims. Then came the detail that explained the case in a colder way than hunger ever could. Ilshat said, "I've always wanted to be a surgeon, but it's better to be a cannibal. If you're a surgeon, you have to put the body back together. But a cannibal kills and then he can do whatever he wants with the body." This was no longer only about a starving man in a collapsing city. It was about obsession and control. By the time the case reached court, investigators had linked Ilshat Kuzikov to 3 murders. They believed there may have been more, but the charges had to follow what could be proven. The evidence from the apartment, the remains found near the building, and Ilshat's own statements tied him to Alexander Pichonkin, Mikhail Bochkov, and Edik Vassilevski. But the court still had to answer another question. Could Ilshat be held criminally responsible in the ordinary way? His defense requested a forensic psychiatric examination, and that examination became the turning point. Dr. Valery Ivanov, who tested and studied Ilshat, concluded that he had schizophrenia. He also concluded that Ilshat had necrophilia. That finding changed the path of the case. On March 20th, 1997, the Saint Petersburg City Court found Ilshat legally insane. The court released him from criminal liability, which meant he would not serve a normal prison sentence for the 3 proven murders. Instead, he was sent to compulsory treatment at the Saint Petersburg Psychiatric Hospital of specialized type, with intensive supervision on Arsenal Naya embankment. Before that decision, Ilshat had reportedly been held in Kresty, the famous Saint Petersburg detention center. And even there, among other detainees, his reputation created fear. The prisoners were so disturbed by who had been placed near them that they took turns staying awake at night. But after Ilshat Kuzikov was sent to compulsory psychiatric treatment, the public story around him became harder to follow. Some reports later claimed he had died in the hospital in the early 2000s, but that version did not hold. In 2017, hospital sources reportedly confirmed that Ilshat was still alive and still receiving treatment. Then, according to a later source, he tried to seek release through the court in 2020, but the request was refused. So the case did not simply end in 1997. It disappeared behind hospital walls. But this case was never only about Ilshat Kuzikov. It was also about the men no one searched for quickly enough. It was about neighbors who complained and were dismissed. It was about a psychiatric system that already knew he was unstable and violent, but still failed to stop him before 3 men were dead. And by the time police finally opened the door to that one-room flat on Ordzhonikidze Street, the question was no longer whether Ilshat had killed. The question was how many chances had already been missed. And that's where this case comes to a close. What do you think about everything that happened? Share your thoughts in the comments. If this story stayed with you, there are more cases on the channel that explore situations just as disturbing. Make sure to subscribe, leave a like, and share the video. It helps keep stories like this from fading away. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.